Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for more dedicated Legacy action. This one, we are looking at the new cards coming out for Modern Horizons 3 and how they're going to impact Legacy. So I've picked 35 cards I think might have a showing in Legacy, and I'm going to talk about what they are and why I think they might see some play. So let's get right into it. First up is Detective's Phoenix. This is seeing a little bit of buzz around it. I'm not entirely convinced. A 3-mana 2/2 flying haste is not great by Legacy standards. And the backup plan of it being able to bestow it from your graveyard to give something +2/+2 flying and haste is okay. I think if you put this on a Murktide Regent and you just get a big bash later on in the game, that's fine, but you're probably not playing this on a Murktide Regent because you're exiling your graveyard. So I'm not actually sure how good this is, but I know a lot of people are thinking about testing it, and I'm more than happy to be wrong on it. This doesn't fill me with the most excitement, but I think people are going to try it, and it might be a thing that people play with, and then it falls off after a little bit of time. Because I think in terms of what you're using your graveyard for, there's much better things to use your graveyard for than collecting evidence for this. That being said, the collect evidence thing isn't 6 cards, it's 6 total mana value. Now, generally in Legacy, your mana values are going to be quite low to the ground, but there are a few things that will help bump this up. Things like Force of Will, and things like Murktide Regent, stuff like that, which are good to exile to this because they can take much of that 6 in one chunk, or even all of it in the case of Murktide Regent. So maybe it is going to see some play there. People are going to play around with it. I'll definitely play it at some point, but my hopes are slightly tempered on this one. Next up, we have Kozilek's Command. Now, this card is not particularly exciting either, in my opinion, but it does something that colourless decks sometimes struggle with, and that is giving some removal at a reasonably costed rate. So people would play Warping Whale in some colourless decks. This is pretty much better than that, because if you pay like 4 mana for this, which should be easy if you're playing Ancient Tombs and Sea of Traitors, then you get to get yourselves a couple of spawn and exile a 2-drop. Or, you can mess with your opponent's graveyard, or you can dig into your deck and try and find something. So sometimes what would happen in these colourless decks, if we're talking more like colourless Stompy, like Eldrazi back in the day, you would sometimes end up with a bunch of mana and not really being able to go with it. This allows you to scry a little bit and sort of dig for it whilst giving yourself a little bit of room to work with. So I think this card has some potential in the form of the Eldrazi Stompy decks, which I think people will start trying to play again. I don't know how good they're going to be, but they're going to see some play for a little bit whilst people are figuring it out. Next up, we have the Creation of Avacyn. It's 1 black saga. So first up, you search your library for a card, exile it face down. Then you turn it face up and lose life equal to its mana value if it's a creature card. And then you put the exile card onto the battlefield if it's a creature card, or into your hand. So this is kind of like a slow tutor if you're trying to do things like Profane Tutor in your deck now, which is a card that sees fringe Legacy play. This is kind of doing a similar thing, but also has the added bonus where we can just search for a creature and put it in. So it's kind of like a black show and tell that's a bit slower. So there are people running mono black reanimation decks, and sometimes they do struggle a bit against some graveyard hate because they don't have the flexibility of the decks that running blue, where they get to play show and tell and things like that, or like bounce effects for ley lines or whatever. So this could be that effect for those people. But this card is also fine in some matchups just to, if you Dark Ritual this out turn 1, then maybe you're going to be getting yourself a shoulder in a couple of turns, and that is fine in certain matchups. I don't think this card is going to be amazing, but I think it's going to see some fringe Legacy play, especially in Mono Black Reanimator out of the sideboard, potentially. Next up, we have Urza's Cave. This is a colourless land that taps for colourless. So it comes in untapped, which is nice. It has Urza's type on it, which is also pretty handy for things like the Urza's Workshop, which counts the amount of different Urza lands you have. And the ability on it is pretty interesting. So 3 mana, tap, sacrifice this, search your library for any land card, and put it on the battlefield tapped. Now, 3 mana is a very steep rate for this effect when things like Elvish Reclaimer already exist, which allows you to do that every turn for just 2 mana. And obviously, we're living in a world of crop rotations and things like that. But the fact that this is on a land means it's an uncounterable tutor, which is not nothing. So I think there may be some people tinkering around with this one. I'm not wholly convinced, but I think it's worth trying out in a few spots here and there, because uncounterable is a big deal. Obviously, I play a lot of Turbo Depths, and I know that when you have your uncounterable Thespian stage lines, it just completely undoes some opponents. So maybe this can find a little bit of juice in something a bit like that. Next up, we have Thief of Existence. So this is a 3 mana, 3/4, which is a pretty reasonable rate. And when you cast a spell, exile up to 1 target non-creature, non-land permanent and opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. If you do, Thief of Existence gains when this creature leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. So this is kind of like a Skyclave Apparition, but in green. Now, we can't hit creatures with it, which is important, but it does hit a whole bunch of other things. So non-creature, non-land permanent is going to cover a lot of permanents that do exist in the Legacy format. I think this is pretty reasonable, and 3/4 is a good size. We see things like Endurance being played just as beaters in some cases where they have beaters with a potential upside, but even when it's just a 3/4, I've certainly played decks where I'm happy just to have that 3/4 flash. This obviously doesn't have flash, but we got this other ability which impacts our opponent. So I think if people are going to try and play some Eldrazi Stompy, I'm definitely going to give it a go at least. I think this is a card that is looking like one of the things you want to cast, especially since it's in the right colours for what we're trying to do as well with a lot of the Eldrazi decks, because they tend to be wanting to lean into green a little bit, is my experience playing them back in the day. If you're going to go anything other than colours, that is. Once upon a time, we were playing World Breakers in our Eldrazi Stompy decks, so this is a lot lower on the curve and does similar-ish things. Next up, we have Emperor of Bones. This is a 2-mana 2/2 Skeleton Noble with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to one target card from a graveyard. So let's just talk about this first line of text. Having Incidental Graveyard Hate is very good in Legacy right now. And this does exile a card the turn you play it, so that is really handy. Obviously, you're only exiling a card at sorcery speed. Well, sorcery speed at the beginning of your combat, so your opponent will get a chance to respond, and you won't be able to do this in response to anything. However, Incidental Graveyard Hate is really nice. And it's up to, so it's not like previous cards that saw play a long time ago in different formats like Jotun Grunt, where you'd have to keep exiling cards from graveyard, and if it couldn't feed, it would be put into the graveyard. But then there's also other text that makes this card really interesting. So, 1 and a black, adapt 2. That means we put 2 counters on our creature. And then whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Emperor of Bones, put a creature card exiled with Emperor of Bones onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains haste, sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. So this can exile your opponent's big creature that they've like Faithless Looting into the graveyard, and then you can get it for a turn. That is quite a powerful effect. And someone like the Mono Black Stompy stylish deck lists have been running Vadmir New Blood, which is basically just a 2-mana 2/2 that can grow when you commit crimes and eventually gain lifelink. So the sort of slot of the 2-drop has a little bit of wiggle room, and I think this is quite good. I don't think this is better than like a Douthie Voidwalker, which is just a hard and fast no to graveyards. But this can block, which is relevant. It can grow a little bit, and it can give you a big creature, so it's a good complement alongside Douthie Voidwalker, in my opinion, and it might see a little bit of play here and there. You can also exile your own creatures from your graveyard and use this as a way to set up like a combo. So that's pretty nice too. Next up, we have the Necrobloom. The downside here is that type line. Legendary creature. Legends are notoriously awkward in Legacy if they cost more than like 2 mana due to Karakas bouncing them. But this card has a lot of juice going on that is worth the squeeze for some decks, I would say. So it's 4 mana for a 2/7, which is a weird stat line, but it's going to be hard for a lot of decks to deal with. And then landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 0/1 plant token creature. If you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie. So this is Field of the Dead on a guy, but if you don't have Field of the Dead up and running, you're still getting 0/1s, which can go under the burst, keep you alive, be sacrificed for whatever. But the really interesting part of the text to me is the next bit. Land cards in your graveyard have Dredge 2. So this means if you have a Wasteland and this creature, you have a Wasteland lock. And you can just dredge your Wasteland every turn and hit your opponent. That feels like a very powerful thing to be doing in Legacy. We see people playing Life from the Loam and Crucible Wasteland locks quite often. You even see people playing the 2-mana Merfolk, whose name escapes me right now, that when it deals combat damage, you can get a land card from your graveyard. People are running that in some fringe decks, but you know, it does exist. So having a creature that just allows you to dredge whatever land you want is powerful. Whether or not the mana cost will allow this to see play, I don't know, but the effect of Wasteland locking is really strong. So I would be curious to see if this can get played anywhere. I'm sure there's some Nick Fit players, because they love stuff like this, are going to be drooling over this and making sure they jam into some decks, and hopefully I'll get to feature it on the channel in the future. Now we go back to Eldrazi Stompy. So this is Devourer of Destiny. It's a 7-mana 6/6 that when you cast it, you exile target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So, you know, not terrible, but it's quite an expensive spell, even though you're going to be playing it in a deck with lots of like soul lands and stuff like that. But the other text on it is really interesting to me. You may reveal this card from your opening hand. If you do, at the beginning of your first upkeep, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of those cards on top, and exile the rest. Back in the day when Eldrazi Stompy was actually a good deck in Legacy, we used to run Once Upon a Time in it. That was sort of towards the back end of it being a good deck before things changed, but Once Upon a Time was a card that was good enough to run. This is a colorless Once Upon a Time that later on does some more stuff. So you don't get the card immediately from this like we do with the Once Upon a Time. We don't lose the card because the Once Upon a Time goes in the graveyard, whereas this stays in your hand. So it's kind of card neutral, but we get that selection. That's kind of what you need with these big stompy decks. You need to be making the big plays early and often until your opponent is out of the game, right? So your opening sort of hand and first draw or two are essential. So this can smooth that around. So I think this might be worth it. It's going to see some play in Eldrazi Stompy decks. Are Eldrazi Stompy decks going to stick around and be good? I'm not sure, but we're going to try it. And I think this is going to be a component that we're going to want to reach for to smooth things out. The power of selection is really strong. And getting it in colorless, which is obviously not normally a color that you would get to have that, is quite nice. And also, this can find any card to put on top of the library. So Once Upon a Time is a thing that was only getting us creatures and lands, whereas this can make sure that you have that specific lock piece you wanted for your turn one hand, like a Chalice or a Trinisphere if you want to go that route. So it's got some appeal to this to me. Next up, we have one that you probably weren't expecting to see in this list, but I've got a deck list that I'm preparing to play with this. So this is Null Drifter. So it's a 7 mana 4/4 Annihilator 1 flyer. When you cast this spell, draw 2 cards, and it's got Evoke, 2 and a blue. So like Null Drifter before, you're paying 2 and a blue to draw 2 cards and put this in the bin. The difference here is this costs 7 mana. Imagine if there was some sort of spell that wanted you to play undercosted things where they actually had a high mana value. Something like Food Chain, for example, where you evoke this card and then you exile it to your Food Chain, and all of a sudden you've got 8 mana of any color to play with. That is quite a big jump in mana. I've certainly played Food Chain a fair bit, and sometimes you do just evoke like a Fury just to get a big burst of mana, and this does that whilst drawing you cards. And if you've got a lot of mana, you can just play one of these because they're pretty reasonable on the board, just as an object. So I'm going to be playing this card, and that's why it's made my list. Next up is probably one of my favourite cards from Modern Horizons 3. This is the red-white version of Uro, basically. So it's 1 red-white. When you play it the first time from your hand, if you haven't escaped it, it's going to die, but you're going to get your triggered ability of a Lightning Helix. And then you can exile 5 cards from your graveyard and pay red, red, white, white to get it back, just like Uro. And you get that Helix when it starts attacking. You get that Helix. So this does a lot of the things that Uro does. Obviously, Uro draws you a card and lets you put a land in, which is quite a powerful effect. Lightning Helix is also a powerful effect. And sometimes that 3 damage is going to be better than drawing a card. A lot of the time it's not, but there are situations where it will be. The difference is, this is a thing we can do in colors that aren't blue. So we can use this as like a nice top-end thing. I have a deck built ready to go with this, which is one of the reasons I'm quite hypey on it. But I think this allows other colors to have that sort of inevitability at the end game, and it does close the game very quickly. Like, it's clocking for 9 a turn, and it's being able to remove stuff, it's bolstering your life total. I'm quite excited about this one. I don't think it's going to change the meta or anything, but it's a nice tool for some sort of more fringy decks. It could potentially also see play in like a Jeskai control shell, although the red, red, white, white might prove a little bit awkward on that front. However, the Jeskai control shells, they're trying to run things like Triumph of St. Catherine, but that squares up poorly against 6/6s, which is, you know, what Uro loves to do and dominate that sort of late game stage of a match. Whereas this can go toe-to-toe with Uro, do some other stuff. It's by no stretch of the imagination as good as Uro. I will say that right now, but I think it is good enough to see play. And like I said, I've got a deck list that I'm really excited to play with this that I think is looking pretty tasty as a deck. Next up, we've got a Goblin. So for old Magic boomers like me, we used to play Mog Fanatic back in the day. This is just Mog Fanatic times 3 on one body. And the really interesting thing about this to me is that it's deal 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So you can use this to ping down a bunch of 1/1s, which is a lot of value right there. And Orcish Bowmasters, that is a thing that you want to ping down both parts of. This can do that nicely, but you can also just sit and play and threaten damage against your opponent. And Goblins is a real deck. People are playing Goblins now. Obviously, Turbo Muxus is gone from Legacy, but people are still playing like a couple of Muxus in like a more traditional Vile Goblins deck, and those decks are still doing all right. You know, there's some Goblin experts who are putting up numbers with it relatively regularly, and I think this will probably slot nicely into that. It's a great tool to have, and it's a more reliable source of damage than the black and red Goblin that flashes in and domes something for the amount of Goblins you have, because this doesn't require you to have other resources. Next on the list is Grist Voracious Lava, who turns into Grist the Plague Swarm. So this is a 1 mana 1/2 Death Touch creature, which is not incredible, but doesn't die to Orcish Bowmasters, so I'll take it. And when this card or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it entered from the graveyard or you cast it from your graveyard, you may pay green. If you do, you flip this. Well, you have to make a little bit of effort to make this work, but the backside is pretty good. So it's +1, make an insect token, and maybe they get Death Touch. So it's very similar to regular Grist, except instead of getting a second insect, you might get Death Touch, which is a very powerful thing to have on a bit of chaff. Then you have -2, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So a bit like the other Grist, except instead of hitting creatures, we're hitting artifacts and enchantments. And there's plenty of those in the format, so there's going to be a good chance that we have targets for this. And then the -6 is for each card in your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 black insect. So if you've got any useful abilities, that's going to be pretty handy. I can imagine this slotting quite nicely into a deck with Fiend Artisan, because you Fiend Artisan this Grist up, and then there's plenty of ways that you can cast creatures from your graveyard, or put creatures back from your graveyard if you want to go that route. You could run it with something like a Bloodghast, along with another card that I'm going to discuss later on the list. That might be quite good as a way of getting this up and running. Obviously, Bloodghast is not a thing you hear about a lot in Legacy, but I think it might be getting better in the near future. But I think this card is pretty good. Being able to Green Sun Zenith for this as an option seems quite nice, even though you have to work a little bit to get it to flip. But we've seen how the Cradle Control decks can really utilize having tools that look a bit like this. Next up, we have Talon Gates of Madara. So this is a land. It enters untapped, only taps for colorless, but you can use it to filter color, which isn't really what you want to be doing. And when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature phases out. That can be your creatures or your opponent. So you can remove a blocker for a turn, or you can save your creature from removal for a turn. I know some of the Cradle Control experts out there have already started testing with this card. It does similar things to Sajiri's Step, but has a different spectrum of flexibility because you can hit your opponent's creatures and phase them out for a turn, which I think is really nice. It also has this other ability where you can pay 4 just to put it from your hand onto the battlefield. That's not going to come up that often, but sometimes it will be 4 mana, save your creature, or 4 mana, remove a blocker. So you can keep it in your hand for surprise blockers like Endurance or whatever, and that is something that certainly has some merit. So I know people are testing this one already, so I do expect to see people playing it in Legacy. Is it going to remain a thing that people play in Legacy? I don't know, but it's definitely going to get tested. And if good players are testing it like I know they are, then at some point it's probably going to put out some results. Next up is everyone's favourite new little puppy. This is a 2 mana 2/2 legendary dog with flash. When it attacks, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent. At the beginning of the next end step, return that card to battlefield under its owner's control. If it entered under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on this dog. So this is kind of like a Flicker Wisp, except it does it on attacks rather than enter the battlefield, which means you can reuse this effect multiple times, which is nice. It also grows your thing, which is nice. The downside being it's a legend, so it gets bounced by Caracas, resetting all your +1/+1 counters, and you don't get the immediate blink, which is something that you might want from like Flicker Wisp. It is a staple part of the Death and Taxes deck. What I will say about this though, because it has flash, you might be able to catch some people out. It doesn't have 1 toughness, so it doesn't die to Orcish Bowmasters. So you can flash it in at the end step and then you get to attack pretty quick with it. Having flash creatures in Death and Taxes is always nice. Whenever they have an Ether Vial, they feel a lot stronger because they get to put creatures in with flash. Having creatures that just naturally have flash is quite interesting too. I am certainly not a Death and Taxes player. This just looks like a boring little white creature to me. But I've played against Death and Taxes. I've played it a little bit myself. And I know how powerful that the less than impressive parts end up when you put them together as a whole. And this could certainly be part of that. We've seen Charming Prince see play in these sort of Death and Taxes, or even things departing from Death and Taxes a little bit and changing up some of the cards. We still see blink effects doing work, whether it's Ephemerate or Charming Prince, like I said. So I would imagine that this has a place, or at the very least, people are going to try it out. We all know how good Brainstorm is. What about Brain Surge? So Brain Surge costs 3 times as much as Brainstorm and only draws you 1 more card. But you still only put 2 back on top. So this is actually card advantage. And putting things back on top of the library in a world where we live with like miracles and counterbalance is really important. Being able to filter your hand is really important too. So I think this card is probably going to see a little bit of play. I know a few players who I respect have been talking about this card and want to try it out. And I can certainly see why. The ability to fix your hand is really important. Like drawing 4 and putting 2 back is a lot of alteration to your hand and can dramatically change where you're set up. I do worry that 3 mana is a lot, but it is card advantage and it is an instant, so I think it's definitely going to see people trying to fiddle around with it, probably in some sort of like Jeskai control-y type shell would be my guess, because those are the decks that have the time and space to cast these sorts of spells to pull ahead. That being said, we do live in Orcish Bowmaster's world, and this is an expensive spell to cast whilst also holding up removal to make sure you don't get Bowmastered. So that's another thing to consider, but when this shows up in some sort of 5-0 decklist in a league, it's not going to surprise me. For all you fans of Nickfit out there, we've got a new tool for you. This is Flare of Cultivation. So 1 green, sorcery, you may sacrifice a non-token green creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost, and search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. This feels like a pretty good way of sacrificing a Veteran Explorer. Not only do you get 2 lands off the Veteran Explorer, you get a 3rd land into play with this and another one into your hand. That is a huge amount of ramping that's going to allow you to play your big top-end monsters that you try and take over the game with when you're playing Nickfit. For those who are unfamiliar, Nickfit is like a green-based deck, usually green-black based, but has various other splashes along the way. And what it does is it plays creatures like Veteran Explorer, sacrifices them to get more lands out of their deck, and basically tries to win the game by having basic lands so that you get an advantage over your opponent. And then once you've got those basic lands in play, you're playing bigger spells. Because normally Legacy is about lower mana cost spells trying to stay close to the ground because you may not have enough time to maneuver and get to like your bigger mid-rangey stuff. But if you've got stuff like this alongside Veteran Explorer, it's going to be a lot easier for you to get towards your bigger spells, which do take over the game. Like that's the thing about these like big creatures. When they stick around, they actually do a lot of work. It's just hard getting to that point and being in a position where you're not just on the back foot entirely. So this might see play in that. I definitely know some people who are testing it in Nickfit, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this making some little waves, although Nickfit is going to remain a niche deck because that's, you know, the kind of way it is. But I'm excited that they've got some new tools to play with. Next up we have Winter Moon. This is a 2-mana artifact. Players can't untap more than 1 non-basic land during their untap steps. So it's kind of like a slightly weaker Back to Basics. And Back to Basics does see a bit of fringe play, but being 2 mana rather than 3 mana is a big deal. But this isn't blue, so I won't pitch to Force of Will, and they do get to untap a non-basic land once a turn. So it's kind of like Winter Orb meets Back to Basics. And Winter Orb and Back to Basics both see some fringe play. I would say Winter Orb in the tempo decks does look quite oppressive sometimes. Can just shut out certain decks. This card is not as good as that. Like the decks that want to be playing this are going to want to have a lot of basics of their own. And those sorts of decks tend to be more on like the sort of blue-white control-y spectrum where they don't really care that much about these sorts of effects. They'd rather play a harder piece of disruption for people's non-basics. So things like Blood Moon, for example. So I'm not big on this one, but I think people are definitely going to try it out. And I think people are definitely going to get caught out with it because 2 mana is a really important number in Legacy when people are running things like Lotus Petal, Mox Diamond, Ancient Tomb, stuff like that. Obviously, if you Ancient Tomb this out, it means you're playing Ancient Tomb in your deck, so you're not necessarily going to be untapping all your stuff as much as you like. But you do get to untap your Ancient Tomb on the first go. But this is obviously less good the earlier on in the game, so it's kind of in a weird spot. I personally am not expecting this to become some sort of Legacy staple at all. But I think people are going to mess around with it. And maybe this should have been low down the list, to be honest with you. But a lot of people seem to be excited by this one, so I thought we'd put it up a little bit higher. Remember good old Tarmogoyf? Well, Tarmogoyf has a big brother, and this is quite a card. So this is 2 and a black, which means it's good to cast off of Ancient Tomb plus, you know, Chromox or whatever, Lotus Petal. It also ramps out perfectly with a Dark Ritual. And it's Tarmogoyf stats. If you watch my channel, I play Tarmogoyf every now and then, and it always impresses me how it's a relatively cheap beta that ends up being big enough to tangle with a lot of the stuff in the format, and it's quite efficient. So this is Tarmogoyf size, but it also has Death Touch and Lifelink, which is a lot of way of controlling some races. But that's not where this card really shines. So there's this line of text here. Whenever Barrow-Goyf deals combat damage to a player, you may mill that many cards. If you do, you may put a creature card from among them into your hand. So this is not only like a big beta that's, you know, reasonable for its cost. It's got 2 useful combat abilities in Death Touch and Lifelink, so it can always attack into stuff and at least get a trade. And every time you attack with it, you're swinging a race in a big fashion. But when it connects with your opponent, if they're not blocking it and losing something, you're getting card advantage because you get to mill a bunch of cards and get a creature card back. This feels like a really good card for the mono-black Stompy decks. A lot of them have been running things like Gix lately, but this card I think is better than Gix in a lot of ways because it's not legendary. It's also a single black, so it's easier to cast off of things like Ancient Tombs, so you can go more stompy and rely on the bigger things. I do think this card is going to see some play. I do like mono black stompy as an archetype, so I think this is going to have some pretty good implications for that sort of deck. Next up, Planar Nexus. If you ask me what deck this is going in, I can't necessarily answer you. But what I do know is when you have an ability like this of it being every non-basic land type, you end up getting with some weird situations that maybe you haven't thought of immediately where it does some absolute work. So this will power up your Cloud Posts. You know, Cloud Post is very much a real deck here, but it'll also, maybe you can do some Urza's like mine, power plant, tower stuff. I'm not convinced that's where this really shines because there's easier ways to get fast mana out of your lands in Legacy. But when you have cards that look like this, which do something really weird and give you all of something, you end up in situations where it finds a home and does something a little bit unexpected. The big example that I can think of from recent sets was Leyline of the Guild Pact, which gives you like mana fixing and makes your cards all colors, like all your creatures and stuff all colors, which randomly means that things like Sign of Draco became great for playing with that. So cards like this have a habit of finding a weird little niche somewhere where it gets to really exploit it. But at the very least, this just allows us to play another Cloud Post, which isn't exactly a problem because the more Cloud Posts you have, the better Cloud Posts get. And in addition, this can help you fix for colored spells in a Cloud Post deck where you've got a lot of spare mana. So I think this card is going to see some play. If you like Growth Spiral and if you like Impulse, boy, do I have a card for you. So this is blue and a green instant. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land from among them onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't, you may just put a card from among them into your hand. So this is Impulse that sometimes also ramps you if the card you're taking is a land. Impulse sees play in Legacy. It's not like a big staple, but you see some of the combo decks like Omnitel and sometimes even regular Show and Tell, they will run an Impulse. This is just the same thing, but better. So I imagine you're going to see this in some of the Omnitel lists. The one downside is this is slightly harder to cast because it's green-blue, but blue-green Omnitel is a deck. It just means that you're not casting this off of your Ancient Tomb mana, but you're probably not wanting to tap your Ancient Tomb just to cast an Impulse anyway. So I think this card is going to see a little bit of play. It's not going to be a staple, but I think you'll see it, you know, for years to come in sort of these fringe Omnitel style decks. Back to Eldrazi Town, we have got Glaring Fleshraker, which is a 3-mana 2/2. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi Spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, and whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield, so including those Eldrazi Spawn tokens that we've been making, you get to ping 1 damage to your opponent. Now, there are some decks in Legacy that just churn out a whole bunch of colorless spells, like the Mystic Forge, One Ring style decks. And what they'll do is they'll just keep playing a bunch of spells, and sometimes they'll kill you with like Aetherflux Reservoir or whatever. This is a thing that doesn't target your opponent, but it will still get stopped by the One Ring. However, this gives you more mana as you're playing your spells because of the Eldrazi Spawn tokens, and you're also working your opponent's life total down. Now, my first question with this is, do those sort of One Ring Mystic Forge decks need a 3-mana 2/2 that does this effect? Or are they fine just with what they're doing right now? I'm not entirely sure, but I've had somebody send me a deck list with this in that I'm really excited to play and I think looks pretty strong. So I think people are 100% going to be trying to play this and work out if it's a way that you can sort of change the deck a little bit, make it a bit more aggressive, and just drain your opponent out quite easily with a lower fizzle rate. I don't think this is going to see play that much in like Eldrazi Stompy style decks, because those decks tend to play not that many spells over the course of a game. The Eldrazi Spawn tokens are nice, but I don't think the other half of it is really going to do as much work for you, and spending 3 mana on a 2/2 might not be where the big Stompy deck wants to go. But I think the decks with all the Baubles and Mox Opals and all that sort of stuff, they draw a bunch of cards, play their hand out, draw a bunch of cards, whatever. Echo of Eons can also help refill your hand and keep going. They're probably going to play something a bit like this. And it kind of gives me a bit of a flashback to the old Disciple of the Vault days where you just play out all your artifacts and ping your opponent down and sort of rinse repeat. So it's a bit like that, maybe. So I think this is definitely going to see some interesting appearances over coming weeks. Back into looking at some lands, we've got Shifting Woodland. So this enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest. We discussed that sort of restriction earlier. It taps for green, which is nice. And the activated ability you have to have Delirium for, which is 4 different card types in your graveyard. But there's a lot of decks that are built around having that ability. So this, for 4 mana, becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn. So if you have a Dark Depths in your graveyard and Delirium, you can make Shifting Woodland become a copy of it and then get a 20/20. That seems like a pretty good thing to do at your opponent's end step. In addition, if you've got something like a Archon of Cruelty or whatever, you can then make this into an Archon of Cruelty for the turn and attack with it and get your triggers or whatever. The fact that it's any permanent means this is a lot of flexibility on a card, and the fact that you get to cheese things like Dark Depths, because this won't have counters on, so it'll be the same interaction assessment stage. This is something I want to try out. I think it looks quite powerful. The fact that it actually taps for a relevant color of mana, because if you're playing a deck like this, you're probably going to have things like crop rotations and stuff in your deck anyway. So having the green mana that comes off of this is really nice, and the fact that it can be untapped a lot of the time is going to be almost a free inclusion, a bit like Besage in a lot of decks. Next up, we've got another little white creature. So this is White Orchid Phantom. So 2 mana, 2/2 with flying and first strike, which is reasonable stats. It will beat a Delver in the air. But when it enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target non-basic land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So this is kind of like a Ghost Quarter, except they get the land tapped. Now, obviously, your opponent is not losing the total number of lands. But in Legacy, there are so many powerful lands you need to interact with that blowing up your opponent's lands and letting them get a basic isn't really the end of the world. In fact, it's something you actively want a lot of the time. So this can take out an Urza Saga, for example. It can take out a Dark Depths. If you've got an Aether Vial on 2, you can do it at instant speed and mess up a Dark Depths combo. There's a lot of utility to this, and people love playing Death and Taxes. It is quite a popular deck, even when it's not necessarily doing that well. And this is just another tool for the arsenal of that deck. And I think I'd be surprised to not see some players messing around with it. It is quite a powerful effect. In the black-white Taxes deck, which is pretty common now, they also run Opposition Agent. And this plus Opposition Agent just does give you a Stone Rain effect. I don't think you're playing it specifically for that combo. I think this is fine just to take out opposing Urza Sagas, which can run away with the game. But it gives you more options for trying to mess with your opponent's mana, which is something that Death and Taxes wants to actively do. Sometimes it runs Richland Ports alongside its Wasteland. Sometimes it's got the land where you pay 2 and then you sack it and blow up their land and get a land for yourself. So I think this is going to see some play in Death and Taxes. Hey, I heard you like Makers of the Moon. What if Makers of the Moon but wet? We have the Merfolk Wizard of Harbinger of the Seas. So 1 blue. Important that it's blue, so you can't just Ancient Tomb Lotus Petal this out. Non-basic lands are islands as a 2/2. So it is just a color shifted Makers of the Moon, but the mana cost is a really big deal here, as well as the fact that turning things into islands in Legacy isn't actually that great sometimes, because blue is by far the most played color in Legacy, and people will have their blue sources to do whatever they need. And ramping this out is going to be very difficult due to the mana cost. And the fact it's a Merfolk doesn't really help it, because Merfolk isn't a very good deck in Legacy. Now, does this make Merfolk better? Potentially. It might do something to help Merfolk out. It's certainly not going to hurt Merfolk, because they can't really be much worse than they are, in my opinion. But we've seen how powerful Blood Moon style effects are, and having non-basic lands or islands against a deck like lands is going to be very good. So the scope of where this card is good is a lot smaller than Makers of the Moon and Blood Moon because of how prevalent islands are, but there are definitely going to be decks where you could board this in and really mess up a land's opponent and give yourself that sort of time and space. I think this is also just going to be a much better fit for some of the Delver decks that have been running Blood Moon in the sideboard sometimes. Turning things into islands feels a lot better, because that also means you're going to have your blue pips able to cast Murktide Regent off of your 1 island in your deck, because all your land's going to be islands at that point. But you will shut yourself off of your other colours if you play this. So it's not going to be as impactful to the format as like actual Blood Moon and Makers of the Moon. But I will expect to see this in some sideboards along the way. Psychic Frog is quickly becoming a lot of people's favourite card for Modern Horizons, because it's just a cute little guy that does stuff. So it's black-blue for a 1/2, so it doesn't die to Orcish Bowmasters. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you get to draw a card. You can discard a card to pump it, and it's a +1/+1 counter, so it's a permanent pump. And you can exile 3 cards from your graveyard to give it flying until end of turn to make sure you connect. So this card is quite powerful. It's got some interesting enabling to it. So we know a lot of blue-black decks are trying to put stuff in their graveyard and reanimate them right now. This helps you do that. It allows you to mess with combat because you have this ability to pump it whenever you want. And being able to fly over and guarantee those points of damage so that you can get extra cards feels really good. I think this card has a lot of potential. I think some people are thinking of it a little bit like Psychotog, where they're more keen just to put it into like basically anything. I think you need to build around this a little bit more than people initially suspect. I don't think you can just chuck this straight into Delver. I think you need to tweak your list a little bit to try and make some use out of the fact that you're discarding stuff. But again, I think that's fine. I love doing stuff like where you're discarding stuff, getting value. That is one of the ways I like to play Magic. And I think this has a lot of potential, and I'd be incredibly surprised if we didn't see somebody at some point top 8 or win a challenge with this in the coming weeks. It feels like a card that a lot of people like. It does good stuff. It also pitches to Force of Will and Grief, so, you know, it's kind of got it all, really. Mutated Cultist is next on the list. So this is a 2 and a black for a 1/3 Devoid with Death Touch. So the Death Touch means that the body's actually not as terrible as a 1/3 for 3 normally would be. But the reason you play this card is for the text when you cast it. So when you cast the spell, so it doesn't have to resolve, remove all counters from up to 1 target permanent or opponent. The next spell you cast this turn costs 1 less for each counter, removed this way. So this is basically just another Vampire Hexmage, but it gets around counter magic because it's just a cast trigger, and you can play it for 2 and a black, which means Ancient Tomb and Swamp. Like we already discussed that earlier with the new Tarmogoyf. Ancient Tomb plus Swamp is a great way of playing spells, and this can help you do that. And if you have a Dark Depths, you get all your counters. Maybe you also play an Ulamog. I think that may be a little bit cute. I think just having redundant copies of Vampire Hexmage is pretty good. I think got a couple of deck lists with this in already written, and if you watch my channel, you know my love for good old Marit Lage. So anything that goes along with her is going to make me happy. Maybe I'll put it slightly higher up on the list than it should be for that reason, but people are definitely going to be playing this. This is going to be seeing play in mono black depths and possibly in some like green black lists as well. Speaking of green black lists, we have White of the Reliquary. This card is pretty pushed, and I'm excited to play with this one. So it's a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance. It gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard, and you can tap and sacrifice another creature to search your library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped. So we don't get it untapped like you do with Knight of the Reliquary. And instead of sacking specific lands, like plains or forests, to go and get whatever land you want, we're just sacrificing any creature. So in black, there's a lot of redundant creatures. I mentioned earlier Bloodghast. This with Bloodghast is great because you sacrifice the Bloodghast, get a land, the land comes into play, brings back your Bloodghast. If you want to throw in like Retreat to Coralheim or some sort of untappy thing, you can do that, and you can just play every single land in your deck in one turn. And you can do that as early as turn 3 if you wanted to. Well, you could do it on turn 2 with some acceleration. But basically, that is an interesting option that you have here. And being able to pull out the right lands is pretty cool. I think the deck building around this is very different to Knight of the Reliquary. You can't just try and color shift a Selesnya Depths into a Golgari Depths. I think you need to actually think, what am I doing with this card? We need to be having a more beatdown focused approach with lots of creatures. So you need to be a creature deck that then pivots into some combo stuff. So you're not going to be having a giant land package, but you still want a relatively big land package to do the thing you're doing. But this isn't like a 4 of Dark Depths style deck that you're playing this in. You want 1 or 2 Dark Depths to go fetch. And you just want to have like a procession of beat sticks that you can get value with. If they're no longer good for beating, they can turn into lands and let you transition into other plans. This card is very good. We've also seen things like Cradle Control, where they have a nice mix of creatures that are trying to sacrifice for Fiend Artisan and stuff, as well as lands they're trying to dig for with like Elvish Reclaimer, stuff like that. So I think this slots perfectly into those sorts of decks. This is going to win a challenge at some point for sure. Elves have also got a pretty potent tool in the new set. So this is a 3-mana 3/3 legend. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast creature spells from the top of your library. So this is a way that you can effectively draw cards and get a lot of card advantage in like an elf style deck where you have a pretty low curve. A lot of the times you have less dead draws on top of your library, so you're just going to be funneling out a load of creatures. But then the other ability of this is really nice. So green, tap 2 untapped creatures you control, reveal a card from your hand or the top card of your library. If you reveal a creature card this way, put it onto the battlefield. Activate only during your turn. So this is natural order on a creature, right? And you can also natural order from the top of your library too, and you get to see the top of your library, so you know if that's the thing you want to do or not. The cost of tapping this guy and 2 other guys isn't that much in the sort of decks where you want to be natural ordering anyway. So this is just a natural order that you can Green Sun Zenith for, which is pretty strong, and I'd be very surprised if we didn't see people messing around with this. Obviously, it has a downside of being a legend, so it can get bounced by Caracas. But the upside of just being able to play a bunch of cards here is really strong. So card advantage and natural order on a Green Sun Zenith body. This is going to see some play. Speaking of seeing play, this little bird fellow is going to be doing some real lifting in Legacy, I reckon. So this is 1 green and a blue for a 3/4 flyer, which is a pretty good costed body. It is a legend, so it does get bounced, but if they bounce it, you draw a card because it says, creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes a target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn, but that's twice per creature with the way this ability is worded. So if you had something like a Shuko, which has a 0 equip cost, which means you have a 0 mana way of targeting your creature, you can draw 2 cards for every creature you have in play. A lot of people have already been writing some Bant Cephalid Breakfast lists because of this, because that's the deck that wants to run Shuko anyway. It kind of turns a lot of cards in your deck into Skull Clamp, and it means if your opponent's trying to fight you with removal, then you're going to be drawing cards and you're just going to come out on top of that exchange. This card is really, really pushed. I'm surprised looking at this card. As a Magic boomer who's been playing for a long time, never in my wildest imagination did I expect to see all of this on one card from back in the day, that's for sure. This is a very powerful card, and it's going to do an awful lot of work, and I think it's going to have a very sizable impact on Legacy. We spoke about Cloud Post earlier. Well, they've got another tool. This is just a straight up locus, so it's tap, add 1 colorless, so it's an untapped locus land to pump your Cloud Posts, and it's 3 tap, target player mills a card for each locus you control. Now, the milling here isn't going to be the most relevant thing, but what it will do is really jam up the occasional Doomsday player. We just have this uncounterable way of milling them out. And Doomsday is a matchup where Cloud Post is going to struggle a lot of the time. This tool means that that's not necessarily the case anymore, and they have to respect that they could somehow just get milled out from nowhere. So I'm definitely expecting this to see play just because it's an untapped land that says Locust on it. But the mill thing is going to be relevant on occasion, and it might steal you some games in a matchup that's hard, which is what you really want. If you've got a deck that's got a bad matchup and you're getting a new tool that's just generically good, if the sort of the flavor text almost of the mill on this is going to make one of your worst matchups potentially better, that is the exact sort of thing you want to see printed for your deck. So this is going to see some play in Cloud Post, and I have been sent a Cloud Post list, and I'm going to play at some point. Here is my pick for one of the all-time best cards in this set. This card is ridiculous in my opinion. It's white and a green for a 2/2, so you can fetch this off of a Green Sun Zenith, for example. Other creatures have base power and toughness 2/2 and are bears in addition to their other types. So this affects not just your creatures, but your opponent's creatures, which is a huge deal. So if you play this in something like Punishing Maverick, all of a sudden you have a removal spell that will kill anything your opponent plays. Oh, if your opponent's trying to play some giant monster, it's not a giant monster anymore, right? It dramatically changes the board state in a way that is obviously going to favor you because you've built this deck, but there are like a lot of Green-White Maverick and Silesian Adepts, that sort of ballpark of decks at the moment. And this in a Maverick deck is going to do a ridiculous amount of work because you play this alongside a Stoneforge Mystic, all of a sudden you've got a 2/2 holding your Cauldron instead. So that's a much bigger clock. That's 7 damage. That's a 3-turn clock instead of a 4-turn clock. And your opponents aren't going to be able to block it that effectively because all their creatures can be 2/2s, so they're not going to have any big bodies to soak up the damage that's being trampled over. It just feels like this card is going to make some real waves and make the sort of the fair green-white decks a lot stronger. But from one end of the spectrum to the other, this is not for the fair decks. This is Necro Dominance. Black, 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 legendary enchantment, skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, draw that many cards. Your maximum hand size is 5. If a card or token will be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So this is like the new Necropotence. And you can pay a whole bunch of life and draw a whole bunch of cards. Now, obviously, you're going to have to discard down to 5 at the end. But there's so many things you can do with this. Just finding the right selection of cards. You can just pay the life you need. And if you're playing a deck with Laydown of Anticipation, which I've certainly seen some of the Storm experts like Tony Scapone messing around with a lot lately, that card just allows you to draw your whole deck and then just combo off at the end step. And you can do that on turn 1. This card is very powerful. If anyone like me has played with Necropotence, you know how strong these effects can be. I've seen some people even speculating that this is a card that is going to get a ban at some point. And it could do. This effect is incredibly strong. Just converting your life into cards. We've seen how good Grizzlebrand is. You don't have to do any hoops and stuff to get this into play, really. It's just black, black, black. It's not like you have to put it in your graveyard and reanimate it like a Grizzlebrand or whatever. So this card is going to see some play, and it's going to absolutely lead to some pretty over-the-top combo turns where you get absolutely destroyed, or maybe you're the one doing the destroying if you're a combo player. Getting near the very top of the list, we have Vexing Bauble. This card is a game changer. It's a 1-mana artifact that you can pay 1 and sacrifice to draw a card with. So if it's not good, it replaces itself for the same mana as a Soulguide Lantern replaces itself. Soulguide Lantern sees main deck play, yes, because it can be tutored off of as a Saga, but even Delver decks are running a couple now because it's just good in the meta. And like I said, you can just draw a card if it doesn't do anything. But what does this card actually do? Well, whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. That is one hell of a line of text for Legacy. That's Mox Opals, that's Mox Diamonds, that's Lotus Petals, that's Pitchcast Griefs and Furies and Endurances, it's Force of Wills, it's Dazes. It hits so many things in the format and really gives a big leg up to the fairer decks. Like if you're a combo deck that can play without needing 0-cost spells, you can just play this and know that you're not getting your spells counterspelled. And that is an incredibly powerful thing to do. You can tutor off of Urza's Saga, which is obviously one of the staple engines of the format. Obviously, do you want to be having this in play when you're an Urza Saga deck? Not always, because you're going to have a lot of 0-drops of your own, but having it as an option to tutor for when you do want it is incredibly powerful. This card is going to change Legacy, in my opinion. I think we are going to see a lot of these up and down deck lists, and it's going to fundamentally change the way that you approach playing Legacy in a similar fashion to Orcish Blaymasters, where you have to reevaluate how you're playing cards and how you're building your deck. This card is serious business. But I have something that I've put even higher in my list than this, so let's find out what it is. So I've included this as 2 slots effectively on my list, but we're actually going to be talking about like 10 cards here. But I've just pulled up the most important ones. So these double-faced lands are going to have a significant impact on Legacy. We've already seen how much things like Agadeem's Awakening, Shatterskull Smashing, and even Seagate Restoration, they've changed Legacy when they came out because they allowed you to play decks with lands that didn't have any lands for the purposes of things like Charbelcher and the Oops All Spells creatures. Now, Oops All Spells, the biggest weakness of that deck is the fact that it only gets to run 4 Agadeem's Awakening. So you have 4 starting bits of black mana that aren't artifact mana. Now they get to run 12. That is a huge amount of black mana they have access to. And all of these can enter untapped as well, which is ridiculous. And obviously like Charbelcher and stuff. But these are like the best ones that I've picked out. You can have a look at the rest of the cycle. There's 2 in each colour. But even the creature here of Boggart Trawler being a thing that can enter the battlefield and exile a graveyard, that is pretty good. That is better than Agadeem's Awakening. So all the decks that are playing Agadeem's Awakening, which is there's quite a lot, are just going to play this instead. This is just a better card. So they're going to play that. And that's going to be giving main deck Graveyard Hate that is actually just going to be a land most of the time, but it pitches to Chrome Mox and it allows you to have no lands in your deck. Like, I think that might have been a mistake to print 10 more lands that aren't technically lands in your library. Like, the one to destroy a creature for 4 mana is very overcosted for doing that. But again, you're basically playing it for this side, and sometimes the spell side is flavor text that actually does something. Or sometimes it's just pitching to Chrome Mox, but yeah, this side doesn't have to be good. Like, Agadeem's Awakening is a bad card on the front side. It's the fact that it's a black card that is a land, which is why it's played. And these are just so much better than those. And this blue one is absolutely incredible. So 1 blue, return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So this is a land that also bounces the problem permanent that's stopping you from comboing off, whilst also not being a land. So it just does it all, really. These cards are, I'm going to say, I think they might be a mistake to give Oops All Spells this many lands to run with, because that deck is pretty reasonable, and they've just made it so it's so incredibly consistent, and its fail rate is going to be so low now that I think I'm just glad that we have Vexing Bauble, because I think we're going to need it, given the fact that they printed these 10 lands that are really going to shake things up. I know it may not be the most exciting thing to finish on with my top list, but I do think that these spell lands are kind of outrageous, to be honest, and they are going to make a huge difference. Like, we know they're going to see play. I 100% guarantee you that you're going to see all of these cards in top 8 lists in coming weeks, because people are already playing worse versions of these or wanting these. So, yep, that's my pick for the number one thing that's going to see play in Legacy. Sure, it's a bit of a cop-out of picking effectively 10 cards, but Counting it as 2 for the purposes of my list, and I think you can agree with me that these cards are going to make a massive change to the format in terms of how reliable some combo decks are, and I'm willing to stake my reputation on the fact that these are going to see some play. Alright, so that's my list of my picks for the best legacy cards in Modern Horizons 3. Do you think I've missed any? I certainly might have done. I'll be honest, I kind of passed over the energy cards a little bit because I think they kind of need a critical mass of stuff to really be good. And I'm not necessarily sure that's where you want to be in Legacy. But I think if there's anything I've missed, it's probably going to be an energy card. But if you think I've missed anything at all, by all means, let me know in the comments. I'm always interested to see the opinions of you lovely people that watch my channel. And with that, remember to like and subscribe because I'm going to have some Modern Horizons 3 Legacy content coming up on my channel very soon. So you don't want to miss it. So make sure you subscribe. It also helps the channel out. And why not drop me a like too? All right, I hope you've enjoyed me going through all these. And please let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye. If you'd like to support me in the channel, please check out my Patreon. It has a free guide to budget Turbodepts as well as 3 tiers of support. A low-cost one that enters you into my monthly raffle for a free donation deck on the channel, a mid-tier subscription that gives you access to my detailed Turbodepts guide that is updated every month as well as regular articles, and lastly, the higher tier gives you all of the above as well as a monthly donation deck for my channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel this way, please check out the link in the description.